everyone gather around because I've got another exciting speaker here with me. Hailing from South Africa, now based in Munich, and one of those few people that managed to condense Houdini knowledge to an extreme degree, I would say. So you got like your 30-second or 60-second Houdini tips, is that what you do?
Yep.
Is it 30, 60?
It started as 30, but then Instagram and TikTok allowed it to go to 60, so I could slow down and breathe a little bit more.
I think here we're allowing you for 60 minutes, that is. So I'm very excited what you're going to show us.
I will speak... No.
So please give it away for Paul Esteves.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So my name is Paul, and if you've never met me and you don't know who I am, I'm that guy over there. And I haven't used PowerPoint in, 15 years. And PowerPoint now has a draw function, so I started using the draw function in a bunch of my slides. And then I removed it because it looked really bad, but I kept it in this one. So I'm that guy, and this is my family. They mean a lot to me, so I figured I'd show you who they are. I'm a freelance 3D artist, and I like to make bright, colorful pictures. I don't have a lot of videos because pictures are easier to put in a slide. But I generally like to make things super bright, super saturated. It kind of like takes me into a bit of like a different world where AI is taking our jobs and life sucks and there's wars and whatever. And then you kind of get into 3D and it just lets you escape reality and you, go somewhere else. And that's the kind of work that I tend to enjoy exploring. As Moritz said, I currently live in Munich, Germany with my family. We moved there 5 years ago, but originally I come from a little town or city in South Africa called Durban. And if you don't know anything about Durban, it's like a little beach city. So I grew up going to the beach a lot, and I lived right by the beach. And so basically overnight, I went from this to this. And so, yeah, that's me. I do these little quick kind of social media node videos. So like if you're getting into Houdini, it's usually 30 seconds, sometimes 60 seconds, and they're filled with GIFs, which offend a lot of people, but I keep doing it. I wear low-cut V-neck sometimes, that offends even more people, but people keep watching it and keep telling me how much I offend them. Yeah, so you can check those out, they're there. And I kind of the reason I started this whole series was in 2020 when lockdown hit. I was stuck at home, we couldn't go into studios when I was freelancing. So in order to try and like connect with people and just like, hey, I'm out there, I started making these and people enjoyed them, so I kind of kept doing it. And it's been a great way for me to learn Houdini, like take one node and just like see how far you can push it, and then you read the side effects documentation, which most times doesn't make too much sense to anyone. And then you just start moving sliders around, and then I kind of put my results over there. I also have a Patreon, so if you want to spend money, you can come and hang out on Patreon, where every month I take a different scene and I break it down, and they're generally more kind of MoGraph scenes where there's a lot of like VFX content out there, but I find that there's not as much MoGraph content, and so I wanted to kind of like lean more into that and show some of the stuff that I do and how I do it and how to get into Houdini. It's generally pretty basic. There's nothing too crazy complicated about it. My social media handle is Paul Esteves 28. Because Paul Esteves was taken, so I picked a random number that was on most of them. And so it's Paul Esteves 28 on most places. So you can find me, wherever you hang out and come visit me. For today's talk, I named it the Ultimate Houdini Hacks, or Hack, and then eventually I changed it to Hacks in my mind because there's multiple. And it's probably not the ultimate, but if you said like the average Houdini hack, like no one's going to click that video, so or come to my talk. So I like made it big, and it's the ultimate Houdini hack, But I kind of want to show like a bit of my process, just like XK did. Don't think that mine's going to be like XK's. Mine's not. But kind of like my process of when I jump into a project and I'm exploring ideas and like trying to take a project from start and then like make it cooler, like the things that I think about and some of the hacks or the techniques that I use to try and add visual interest to my projects. And so the first one we're going to do is take a look at this super saturated little floppy flower that's ultra photorealistic. But as I said, I like these kind of like bright, fun things rather than super photorealistic. Sometimes I do that, but we're going to take this. And I want to kind of like break it down step by step. So if you're new to Houdini, like this is how I would approach it. And this is how we would build these projects. And so in Houdini, I'm going to start with a line, and this is to create the base shape. And you can use a tube with like end caps, but I found that doesn't usually look good as a tube. Like it does like this weird warping thing. And when you use a line and a sweep, you get like all sorts of other results, like or controls, where the sweep allows you to like get UVs, and you can twist things, and you can shape things, and you can make it bigger and smaller, and it's a lot easier to control. And so I love using lines and sweeps, and then subdividing it to get it deeper. And then I'm adding normals. And if you haven't used the Houdini a whole lot, you often need to tell it exactly what you want. You can't like assume. So if you come from other software packages, it does a lot of the work behind the scenes for you. Houdini doesn't do that. It makes you do all the hard work. And so you assign normals to kind of assign a directional vector, so that when you put stuff onto that, we're going to copy some objects onto our base shape. Then when you put those objects on, it knows which direction you want those objects to go. So then we need an object that we're going to put on the shape that we're going to use to do something with. And so we just create a line. It's just a basic line. And then I'm going to create a group on the bottom of that line called the root group, so that when we simulate this, I have something that I can stick this to my base shape that's going to stay around, and it's not going to go floating in space. And so I scatter some points, and then I put all these lines on the shape, and it's like that. It's amazing. We're off to a good start. Then I use something called Vellum. Now, if you've never used Houdini, Vellum is like my one true love, other than my wife and my kids. I use Vellum for like everything. It has a cloth solver, it has a soft body solver, it now has a rigid solver, and it also has like this hair solver. And the hair solver basically takes in these curves that we're feeding it, and it simulates them. And so when we start with a hair solver, what we need to do is we need to first give it a thickness, which when this GIF eventually comes back, you can see there that like its default is quite thin. And this is going to be how Vellum calculates the collision between the hairs. So if this is too small, the hairs get too close to each other. And then when we sweep it later and we give it some thickness and like make it look like something, then everything intersects and it looks terrible. And so you just increase this number so that Vellum looks at this as a nice fat tube rather than a really thin one. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to just use that root group that we've already created. We're going to pin it, and this now just sticks it in place. So Vellum kind of like acts as if this isn't allowed to move. It doesn't simulate it. It just sticks it in place. And then we go into the Vellum solver, where I don't do much. I just turn off gravity so it doesn't all just flop down, which is what it would do. And then I dive inside and I add some pop wind. Like, I don't do anything crazy with the pop wind. I just put it on there and move the sliders around. It's super fast, and you can kind of like get something that works. And once you have like a base shape that's moving, it looks like this. Okay, we're starting to get some progress, but it's not looking like amazing, and we're going to get there. Stick with me. I clean off some attributes so we don't have like thousands of attributes that Vellum creates that we don't need. I just want like a nice kind of clean, fresh start where all these pieces are moving around. And then I can sweep it. Okay, as I said, I love sweeps. I use them all the time. And the sweep node is cool because what it does here is it gives me like this profile where I can draw in a shape. And so now I can kind of like art direct this very realistic flower that I'm making, and I can get these like, I don't know, little blobby end pieces that look nice. And because my Vellum simulation is calculating a nice thick piece, they don't intersect too badly. It's not too noticeable, which is cool. So the next thing that I'm going to do then is I'm going to create like a stem. And for this, I just created a line. I added some noise. I actually think I turned this into Kinefix for no reason other than the fact that I wanted to use an attribute wrangle noise because it looks slightly nicer. And then I just give it like a little bit of a jiggle. And I grab the very last point, and then I use another copy to points to put one shape onto that shape. So now I have a stem with the points and my main shape. So it kind of like all connects together. And what we end up with now is this. So it's starting to look a little bit more like a scene. But the problem with this scene is that it's still a little bit boring, right? Like for me, like I look at this, it doesn't loop. It's okay, but I want to make it a little bit more visually interesting. And so what are like my options? And this is kind of like where I get to with most of my projects, and I start to like, and this is where I really love Houdini because it gives you lots of options. And what are my options? Well, the one option we can do is we can make it loop. Okay, now if you're into Instagram, you make things loop, and then people, watch it like pillows, and they pop around, and then people watch hundreds and hundreds of them. And Houdini has this, well, the Houdini Labs has this node called the Labs Makes Loop. and you click it on, and then you change it to primitive, and you hit play, and it does everything for you. You don't have to do anything else, and it just loops it over and over again. And you can specify the number of loops that you want based on your duration or your timeline, and it'll just loop it. So if you have it at 3 loops, it kind of like gets a little bit jittery because it's trying to loop and it's like bouncing around. But if you set it to 1 loop, it gets like this really nice motion over 150 frames. So what that starts to look like then is this. Now you can't really tell because you don't know when the start and the end are, but it's looping. So you can post on Instagram, get lots of followers, your mom will love you even more, and it's a good time. But maybe you don't want to make it loop, maybe you're not into Instagram and you want something else. So like, what are the other options that we have? And Houdini's got you covered. We can get rid of the make loop, and we can go back and we can use one of my favorite toolkits in Houdini. Well, it's not in Houdini, it's a separate toolkit. It's called MOPS, Motion Operators. And Moritz actually started with the current guy that's doing it, Henry. They built it together, and now Henry does it. It's like a independent tools, and it's called MOPS because it's like a motion design kind of basis to try and help Cinema 4D users get into Houdini, which is kind of one of the reasons that I love it. But it's grown into a toolkit that has a host of nodes that are super fun. And there's 2 kind of portions of MOPS. The one is like a free toolkit, and then there's also a paid toolkit, which is a whole bunch of separate nodes. This node is one of the free ones, and it just creates fall-offs in kind of like 3D space really easily. It's really fast. You can do it over thousands of points, and it works really nicely. And this is where, for me, coming into this, I kind of see this as a Houdini hack, whereas some people like see this as cheating, and they want to build their own infection solvers, and unless they build it entirely in Vex on their own, you know, you're not doing Houdini right. And I say to those people, where's your Floppy Flower, you know? Because what ends up happening is you want to build it, and that's cool, but then you have to watch a 2-hour masterclass on Vex, and you get like super sidetracked, and you never actually build your tool because you don't understand what's going on, and you just never get to make stuff. And so I love finding tools like MOPS that just make making stuff a lot easier, and then using them to get my ideas out. And in the process, I learn stuff anyway. It's not like I can't function without, but you just get to move a lot more quickly. So anyway, back into this project. So we make this fall off, and this is just creating a 0 to 1 fall off. So the blue is 0 and the white is 1, or the other way around. I always get it mixed up. And so we can then use this to release these hairs. And so if we go into the hair, vellum hair, instead of permanent, we want to change this to stopped. And the only difference between permanent and stopped is that permanent, it can't change. It's like it's stuck there forever. Whereas stopped, as long as the value of stopped is 1, it stays there. But if the value is 0, it's like, okay, I'm free, let me go. And so we can use this MOPS fall off to change our stopped attribute. It gets a little bit technical because you have to do this inside the vellum solver so that it does it every frame. If you do it outside the vellum solver, vellum only calculates on frame 1. We want to do it every frame. And so we dive inside the solver, we use a Vex wrangle, we run over just the point group, and we use a little bit of Vex that basically says, hey, bring this MOPS attribute in, and then whatever the MOPS value is, write it to the stopped. So where MOPS is 1, be stopped, and where MOPS is 0, fly away. And then that looks like this. So you can see MOPS is now going through and releasing those hairs, and the wind is now allowed to move those hairs and float wherever they want. Whereas where stopped is 1, they stuck in place. So we get a really nice control over this, and we can change how we want to do this based on our MOPS fall off. And then I rendered it. So it looks like this. All right, so this is starting to take shape, and we have a progress in a different direction. And what if we want to do something else to this? And I don't actually know if my next thing you're going to be able to see on the screen, but I'll tell you what I did here. I took a trail node to calculate the velocity, and the velocity is just kind of like the movement. And then I'm using a very simple one-liner there that takes, like, if you're moving really fast, you're going to create a group of that. And so that I can then isolate that group of things or pieces, and it creates this like super crazy looking thing. And then I'm just taking this whole, whatever this crazy looking thing, and I'm putting it into a PopNet, which is like a particle network, and I'm not changing anything. I'm just telling it, like, emit from this like crazy shape, and you get like all these little particles that look kind of like pollen in this crazy mess of mass bees or something, I don't know. And then I just rendered this. Oh, you can kind of see it. I rendered this with like little pieces, so it kind of catches this like little glimmer, and you start to get like a little bit more detail into your simulation. And this is like why I love Houdini, because you can kind of just keep layering things onto each other, and it's so easy because you just take your thing, you add another stream, and you add stuff onto it, and eventually you start to get something that looks a little bit cooler than just a very base shape where nothing fun is happening. So that's project number 1. Project number 2 is this RBD explosion thing. And if you have started learning RBD and you've like wanted to do some explosions, you'll know that like you Google it and then you met with like a 12-hour masterclass on destruction and buildings, and then you're like, okay, do I need to watch this? And you get halfway through, and it's like a 400 gig cache file that you have to like download, and you're like, okay, but I just want like this simple thing to break on the floor. How do I do that? And so this is my like 2-minute primer on that, because it's really basic. But again, it's about like an iterative process of how do we like start from something really basic, and then how can we add stuff to it to make it a little bit more exciting as we go. And so I'm going to start with a platonic object, but this can be any object. It doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to use the built-in tool called the RBD material fracture. And there's a bunch of videos out there saying that this node is really slow and you should do it, and you should build it yourself with the Boolean and this and that. And again, like I find that this is something that SideFX gives us, and if it takes an extra like 1 minute to cut my geometry versus like 3 hours of watching tutorials to do it myself, I'm just going to use the node that they give me because it does cool stuff really quickly. And so what this node does is it basically takes a shape and it just cuts it up into little pieces, like a Voronoi fracture type kind of setup. And so what we can then do with this is create packed fragments. And I'm not going to try and explain what packed fragments are, but basically you create packed fragments when you want to do RBD simulations. And I just use an assemble node and click that button, and it does it for me. And now I want to create some sort of like movement and some sort of force, and we can do that with again, just a one-liner in Vex, which is normalize P. And so as long as your object is in world space 0, it'll just be like an outward-facing force. This is like 0 to 1 is just going out. So at the moment, everything is uniformly going to go outwards in a uniform space. But then I can use an attribute adjust vector, and I use these nodes all the time, just to adjust the length. So now you can imagine that some pieces are going to shoot further out than other pieces. So you kind of get this like really nice, it's starting to get a little bit more organic in the way that this kind of shoots out, so that some pieces are not, it's not uniformly going out, but there's some pieces are moving out a little bit more fast and some are a little bit more slow. And then I use a point velocity just to add some curl noise, and it just kind of adds this like cool, like random, like chaos. And then I throw it into an RBD solver, and we get this amazing, I mean, you can clap if you want. Amazing. Wow. Wow. Thank you, everyone. Wow. And obviously, this looks really bad, but it's like a starting point. And like once you've done this, which takes a few minutes once you like get going in Houdini, it's the question of, okay, so how do we make this better? Like, what are the steps that we can take? Like, what are the things that will make this kind of simulation better? And we can go back to that material fracture node, and like input in is input out. So if we can make this input a little bit cooler, then we're going to be on our way. And all in one node, we can kind of go from this like really base shape into like something that's a lot more detailed, that looks a lot cooler and a little bit more realistic. And the way that we can do that, firstly, is we can add another primary fracture. So you can imagine that if it's taking our shape and it's cutting it up into pieces, then we have another one that's taking those pieces and it's cutting it up. And then we add a third one, and it takes those pieces and it cuts it up even further. And we can add more scattered points, so it cuts it up even into smaller pieces. So now we have like some big pieces, some medium pieces, and a whole bunch of little pieces. But we can take that even further by the little chipping tab, and we just enable chipping, don't have to change anything. And all it does is it adds in all these like little shards. And you can imagine that if you had a rock and you dropped it on the floor, it would have like little pieces of shard. Like it would have little pieces of rock that would break off. And with one click, we kind of get that now in Houdini. And then the last thing we add is the what is it called? I don't even know. The detail. And the detail is like the inner faces, that if you like broke a rock open, the face isn't going to be perfectly smooth. And by default, this makes it perfectly smooth, which is like a dead giveaway. We're in CG world. Whereas now it starts to get this noise, which starts to like hint at, okay, we're getting into something that looks a little bit more realistic. Okay, and so what that now looks like, with a little bit of retiming afterwards, a little bit of slow-mo, it starts to look a little bit nicer. We start to get something that looks a little bit cooler, and if we throw some materials on that, it looks a little bit like this. And there's one guy in the middle there that's glitching. I'm not sure what his problem is, but he didn't want to render properly. And so we're in a good place. But then you have to, again, ask the question, okay, what else can we add? You know, do we want to add particles? Do we want to, what do we add? And then there's like, okay, well, what about if we add some pyro? And truth be told, I thought about this the day before I left, and I was like, oh, that would be cool, I should do that. And so I didn't have a lot of time to play with the pyro render, because it takes a while to render, and I wanted to get it done. So you can make it look a lot better than this, but the whole idea of like just throwing a pyro simulation in there to kind of get this like really cool explosion that like adds a secondary detail into the explosion is a cool idea. And it's really easy to add. You just use something called this debris source, which they, I think, recently overhauled, and you can plug it into this packed geometry. So even if you have like a really dense base mesh, you don't have to unpack it, which can be pretty brutal if you have a lot of polygons. You just plug it into your packed geometry, and it will then, based on some of the parameters that you set, it will create points for a certain amount of time or a number of points that you set. So you can set the lifespan, and if you set it to none, it'll just kind of keep those points going forever. You can also change the number of points that it does, so you get like this really like dense amount of points. And there's a whole bunch of other things. You can play with the speed, and it'll use the speed just like we did with Vellum, and it'll limit the number of points based on the speed of these objects. And it's fun to sometimes just play with this and see what these options give you. And then you have this. So you can throw this now in a particle network just like we did with Vellum, and you can like spray particles everywhere and add extra rock fragments onto that, and you have all this. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do pyro. So I then just did a wrangle to say, basically after 15 frames, I wanted to delete all the points. And I kind of went overcomplicated on how to do that. I could have just done it like on frame 15, all the points must go away. And the reason for that is that the way that pyro works is as long as you have points, it'll keep emitting pyro. And if the points just keep going, then pyro just keeps, and the whole scene just got covered in smoke, and it didn't look great. So I just kind of got rid of those. Then I added a trail node, and this just means for every point I now have 4 points, so that when I threw it into the pyro solver, which I didn't do anything in the pyro solver, you kind of get this like really nice pyro explosion thing. And the whole pyro setup it was basically default, and I did a video for side effects on the pyro solver on how to set it up, so I didn't want to do it here. But it's like the super simplest thing. It's like 5 nodes, and now you have this like really cool explosion with rock and pyro, and it just adds an extra layer. And to me, when I can kind of throw this in and then show it to the studio, generally they're a little bit more like, oh yeah, that's cool. Whereas if you just have like this base thing with like 4 rocks going outwards, and they're like, you spent all day on that, what have you been doing? It's not as impressive. Okay, so then the next thing is like, okay, well, what if we are into Instagram and we do want it to loop? Well, we can make it loop, because everything can loop. That's like my goal in pretty much every project, is how can I make this loop? I love loops, and I love like the technical challenge of making stuff loop. And again, I'm going to come back to a MOPS node that is a part of the paid MOPS toolkit, which makes this like a super, super simple process. And the first thing that we have to do is we need to create a MOPS fall-off. So I'm just creating a linear shape fall-off. I'm visualizing it as spheres because Houdini's viewport doesn't like packed primitives and attributes, so you just visualize it as spheres to kind of see what is going on. Then I'm using a MOPS extract attributes to extract the pivot point. And this is important when you are exploding pieces and then trying to bring them back to their original position, because it needs to have like some sort of pivotal data, or like set the prim intrinsic so that it knows like where to move stuff back. And you don't have to know any of that stuff, because Henry takes care of it for you in the MOPS toolkit. So that's why I love MOPS, because I don't have to think about like prim intrinsics and like what these things do and which data I need. I just lay down a few MOPS nodes, like the MOPS apply attributes inside DOPS. You literally just drop this node down and you tell it the target that you want to do, which is the apply or the extract attribute outside, and it does everything. So you can watch, you'll see now that as it goes down, you see that fall off coming across, and it's just moving those pieces back to where it started. Like, it looks fancy. Well, I thought it looked fancy, but it's actually like 2 nodes. That's all it is. Again, you can do this in Vex. You can. Like, there's tutorials out there, and it's like 4-hour-long tutorials, or you can just use one MOPS node, and then you're done for the day. I like doing the MOPS way. I find that it's like a hack. Cool. So project number 3 is Flip Sims. And I want to show you like my 10 node, I don't even think it's 10 node, I think it's like 4 nodes to do a crown splash. We're going to use the SOP level flip tools, which were just released by Side Effects. And they have a little bit of a bad rep, and I think Side Effects are still kind of like working out some of the details on them, because it's a little bit slower than if you build your own DOP network, and some of the parameters aren't exposed that maybe you would want. But the reality is, when you see how I set it up, you don't need to know much to get a cool result, and sometimes like that's a good way to just get into something to use that. So we're going to start with a flip tank. I'm not sure why it's called a flip tank or a flip container. The SOP level flip nodes have the weirdest names. I don't understand any of them. But every flip simulation when using the flip solver has to start with this flip container or flip tank, and it kind of has like a bit of like the brains behind everything. So it has like the attributes or the parameters that you need, like surface tension, viscosity, RD, and all that. And so all I'm going to do here is make the surface tension really high, something like a value of 60. And if you don't know what surface tension is, it basically is when you have all these particles, it like sucks them together, and it makes them like blob and give you all these blobs. Then the flip tank is going to go into a flip boundary, which you think, okay, that's like the collider that everything's going. No. That's the source. This is the flip source, which I'm not sure why they didn't call it the flip source. They called it the flip boundary, which is weird. So your source comes in the last input, and so we need to create a source. And to do that, I just created a torus, because why not? And then again, I need to set some velocities. Velocities are just going to create the direction that the fluids are going to move. And so here I have 2 different velocities. I'm using this normalized P, which is just an outward force, and then I'm using an up vector. So one is going up and one is going out, and then I'm looping between the 2. So I can kind of set like the direction that I want my crown splash to be. It's either going to go straight up or it's going to go straight out, or I kind of get this like angle in between. And then just like before, I'm going to use attribute adjust vector so that like I have this randomness where some are going further up and some are shorter. So you kind of like get this like more organic kind of flow. And then I'm just limiting it to 2 frames. So I'm using another attribute adjust vector basically to say on frame 1 have full velocity, and then on frame 2 have 0 velocity. Because the way that these SOP level flip tools work is it reads in the velocity every frame, and it'll update every frame. So if you don't turn it off, it'll just kind of keep shooting that fluid into the sky forever, and you get this like monstrosity of a crown splash. And I tried that, and I think my cache was like 400 gigs, and I was just like trying to like constantly emit for 150 frames. So you have to turn it off. And then finally in the flip solver, I turned the timescale down to something like 0.2, and this just gives the flip simulation more time to calculate like all these attributes that you're trying to do. And then I gave it 3 and 6 substeps. In the collision tab, I added a ground plane so that it had something to collide with. And then finally, I turned this from the normal default flip into flip splashy, because everyone says that's what you should do, and I listen to everyone. And then finally, receding, I just turned the value up to 10 so that as the particles move further away from each other, it injects more particles in there. So you don't get like all that flickering with fluid that as the particles move away, like all these holes and gaps happen. And when you render it, you get this. And so you can kind of see like the surface tension is all those blobs, and because I created such a high value, those blobs are quite intense. And you can render it, and it looks like that. Or you can make it blue, and it looks like this. But again, you have to ask the question, okay, so like how can I do this differently? What can I do better? And I didn't actually know for this one, but I had a cool trick. when I work with flip simulations, they are always slow. Like there's millions of particles, and it takes a long time to cache. And often it's hard to iterate these things if you're not entirely sure like what these values do or what you should be playing with. And so something that I really enjoy doing is playing with wedging. Now, wedging, it's not the same as wedgies. It's something in Houdini. But wedging allows you to kind of take certain parameters, set like a threshold in which you want to work, and then tell it to make a number of copies in that. There's an amazing tutorial on Intagma that does like this whole explanation of it. It's amazing. I've watched it. I use it, but it's pretty in-depth. It's pretty technical. Chris did it. He's a genius. I'm not. And so there's a labs node called the labs file cache, and it has a little checkbox that you click, and it has wedging all in one little checkbox. And so I use this a lot too. And what you do is you kind of set the number of attributes that you want to like randomize, and then you can just kind of copy and paste these into their respective fields. So let's say I take surface tension, I name it whatever I want, surface 10. I give it a threshold, in this case, a value of 10 and a value of 120. Then I go to my surface tension attribute and I just say at, and then the value that I created. And I do this for a whole bunch of different attributes. You can do it for as many as you want. And you can see there I have a thing there that says wedge count, and it's set to 8. So I'm just saying like create 8 random wedges. And so I did this, and then what you end up with, I generally do this overnight, what you end up with is something like this that you can send to the client or the studio or your mom if she's into it, like just a bunch of variations. And some of these variations kind of look very similar, and that's because the number of iteration or the parameters that I was changing didn't change a whole lot. So it was maybe, surface tension 10 versus surface tension 20, which didn't change a lot. But you can kind of see like some of them are quite different. And I find that this is a cool way to then come back to the drawing board and say, okay, I really like this one and this one. What are their values? And you kind of go back and it tells you their values. And you say, okay, cool, I need 20 surface tension, I need particle separation of this, I need my velocities of this. Here's a better starting ground. Rather than sitting there all day like, okay, particle separation 0.4, okay, render. And then you wait 40 minutes. Oh, it didn't work, okay. And then it just ends up taking so much more time. The last thing I want to show is kind of like a little thing that I love to always like throw in things and see what it looks like, is to take the clip and mirror. A clip node just picks an axis and it clips it directly there, and then a mirror mirrors the same thing. So you kind of get this like very symmetrical looking shape, and then you can do it in multiple axes. And so then you get like this. And then because we have all these different simulations already done with our file cache, we can then merge multiple of these so that you kind of like get these inset ones, and you can time offset like the different ones and scale them. And when you render it, you kind of get this like super bright that's going to hurt your eyes thing. But if you're doing like concert visuals and stuff, it starts to get kind of trippy and cool, and it just gives you a lot of options when you have all these simulations on hand, and you can kind of like mesh them together and pull them together and try a bunch of different things. So with that, if anyone has any questions, you may ask them. To Moritz, and he'll tell you all about them. No, I'm just kidding. Over there, yeah.
Thank you. Right. So, from the perspective of, I'm a 3D generalist, and I've never touched Houdini, partly because I'm a bit scared of it, and obviously it has this whole reputation. I don't know how true it is, but
it's not true. But yeah, I know the reputation.
It's interesting how I've been noticing how a lot of the programs that I'm much more familiar with, such as Cinema 4D, for example, recently had the Pyro thing, which is really cool and accessible, easy to use. And then Blender also, geometry nodes and all this stuff. So it seems
we don't speak of Blender in this room.
So,
no, sorry, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
But I'm just curious then. Like I know definitely the place that Houdini has in like advanced VFX, but for more of a 3D generalist, do you think that the other more general tools are slowly catching up to what used to only be possible in Houdini? And if that's the case, would you recommend getting into Houdini, and who do you think really needs to get into Houdini?
So I would say if you want to ever work at XK, then you should learn Houdini.
Right.
And if that's not like a good enough answer, no, I'm just kidding. So I know that they are like Cinema 4D just revamped their cloth system, and it's really nice and it's cool. The thing is that it doesn't have all the other tools that Houdini has. It doesn't have all the other like things that you can kind of merge everything together. And maybe they will get there. I mean, it's impossible to say. It just seems like Houdini's always 2 steps forward compared to everyone else. I mean, Blender's moving quickly, but there's whole other issues with Blender. I just know from myself, like I actually can't speak to everyone else. I know I'm hired as a Houdini artist in many situations because it can't be done in cinema. So the studios that hire me often have a lot of Cinema 4D artists that will light and render stuff, but the stuff that I'm hired to do, no one could do, so they bring me on to make it. Whether cinema will get there, I'm not sure. But I think in general, Houdini has enough entry-level nodes, like the stuff that I showed here, that it's super easy to get into, that even if you want to just try some really basic stuff and use that and then bring it back into cinema to render, like you can do that. And I have a lot of friends that do that, where you need 6 billion grains to simulate and the stuff's flying out of grains. You can't do that in cinema, like it just can't handle it. But you can do it in Houdini, and then you can take it across and hopefully render it in cinema if you really want to try. But I think it's worth exploring.
So would it be fair to say maybe with simulations, beyond a certain level of complexity and realism is where Houdini would come in? With that?
Yeah, and for me, it's just like an ease of passage because everything's there and it's one place, and it just talks so nicely with each other that it doesn't make sense to try and like get stuff to work in cinema that doesn't just work naturally, whereas in Houdini it just works so seamlessly. Whether it's basic stuff or super advanced stuff, I think a lot of higher end motion design studios are moving fully into Houdini because of how capable it is to do basic stuff and super advanced stuff all in one package. So why try and mix the two when you can just do it all in one? I mean, that would be my approach.
Hey, Paul.
Hello.
Just curious, are there some other tools you would recommend besides mobs, maybe especially for some people who are transitioning to Houdini from, I don't know, Blender, Cinema, etc.?
So mobs is like the big motion design tool that I would definitely recommend. I think it's super valuable. The other one I use is OD Tools. And OD Tools isn't necessarily like a motion tool. It's more kind of like a pipeline tool. So especially like if you're an indie artist or you like freelance a lot, it has a lot of tools just to help kind of like the general workflow. Whereas if you're working at ILM or one of those where they kind of have guys that build their own tools and file structures and all of that, that's cool. But if you're on your own, well, maybe you can build it. I can't build it, whereas that does. So it has like a really cool, super like featured asset library where you can get mega scan and stuff, and you can just pull textures and double click textures, much like Cinema 4D has their asset library. It just has a whole lot of tools. So OD Tools is one that I recommend. There's QLib and there's AElib, which have a bunch of nodes that like do a whole bunch of cool stuff. I have those installed. I use like maybe 1 or 2 of those nodes, but I think those are free and they have a lot of super useful nodes if you can dig into them.
If someone wants, the mic still open.
You made a comment about doing stuff versus, I guess, watching a 3 or 10 hour workshop about something.
Yeah.
My question is, do you think that there is any time that we shouldn't do stuff and actually sit and watch a 10-hour tutorial?
Yeah, I mean, I was, Mr. John Kuntz is here. I mean, if you're learning Houdini, you know John Kuntz, he's there, and him and I were chatting about this because he's amazing at Houdini and he knows a lot of stuff. And I was asking him the same question. And it's something that I often like wonder myself. I will watch the 10-hour RBD destruction videos because I think that there's a lot of benefit to it. But I know that when it comes down to like, I have an idea in my head, I want to do it, I want to get it out there. I don't want to be like, okay, now I have to watch 12 hours of tutorials. I want to be able to kind of explore and just use the stuff that I know and make stuff. And I think it's a fine line to know when to watch stuff and when to just explore. With my node videos, I tend to just explore. And that's kind of my like outlet of, I'll read the documentation and then I just play. I plug stuff in and I move stuff around. And I find that that's a way for me to figure out what this does in a context that would help me in my projects. And then I watch other tutorials when I have time and if I need to.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. But watch all the Tagma stuff, because their stuff is good.
Thanks for plugging me.
Sub to their Patreon, it's worth it.
Just a question about handling clients and when you give out like wedging, and if you give them like 10 wedges and they are like, maybe like the left part of wedge number 1 and the right part of wedge number 2 or something more complicated. Are you like, okay, I will try to mix them together, or are you like, no, I can't do that because it's simulation?
I'll never say I can't do that. I'll sometimes say like it's going to take a little bit more time if you want to merge those because they're two separate things, and trying to get that right is not a matter of just like changing 2 parameters. And if they understand that and they say that's fine, you can use the time you need to get the result we want, then that's cool. Sometimes I say, oh, okay, no, we didn't understand that. We're happy with number 2. Because clients don't always understand that flip simulations take days to iterate. They think, you know, it's like AI, you just type it in and it happens, whereas we know it doesn't. So you have to then tell them. And even in studios, sometimes the producer has no clue. So you have to kind of just like help them and talk to them and say like, hey, this is cool, but it takes 4 hours. So do we have 4 hours? Do we have 3 days to iterate on this? Or is this a pressing matter?
Okay, so it's like finding the middle to what you can do in simulation and what you can just...
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like what's actually possible and what's not, I mean, anything's possible in Houdini, right? Like, and so if they want that, it's a matter of like, okay, my current setup may not do like the merger of those two, but if I rebuild it and I change the velocities of this and that, and I rebuild how this is going to like move, I will get that result for them, but it's going to take time.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
Yeah.
I'm not overlooking anyone, right? All right, that's good. I mean, good timing, because I think we can afford ourselves a 15-minute break now.
Awesome.
And then Jakub Spacek is on. Spacek? I'm always messing up your name, sorry. Thanks so much.